Among the verses that we read this morning from the book of Leviticus is this: Eish tamid tukad al hamizbeach lo tichbeh. A perpetual fire is to be kept burning on the altar, not to go out. So contextually, we're talking about the laws of sacrifice, animals, agricultural products that would be brought to the altar, burnt and sent up as smoke to God. But there was a fire that was to be kept burning on the altar, even when there was no sacrifice being offered. And the Talmud says that fire was not only to be kept burning even when there was no sacrifice to be offered on the 6 weekdays, that fire was to be kept burning even on Shabbat, even if that meant adding wood to the fire, traditionally forbidden on Shabbat. That fire was to be kept burning even if somehow the altar itself became tameh, became impure. Even if it was not usable, that fire needed to be kept burning. The concern was that there always be a flame, symbolic of God's continuous presence in the space, going atop the altar, rain or shine, weekday or Shabbat, in times of purity or in times of impurity. That fire could not be allowed to go out. Of course, the only thing that we continue to have in our modern synagogue sanctuaries that harkens back to that ancient sanctuary is an ongoing burning flame, our Ner Tamid, our eternal light. We no longer have an altar. We no longer bring, as Clara said last week, a bull to shul, but we do maintain the tradition of keeping a light ever burning, a symbol that God is always here and always with us. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, wrote a collection of commentaries on the writings of the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, the first Chabad rabbi, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. It's the second text on your page. In his Likutei Torah, Reb Shneur Zalman explains that the altar is the heart of the Jew. One of the gifts that Hasidic teaching brought to the Jewish world was a way of taking the rituals described in the Torah and weaving them into the psychological portrait of the individual Jew. It was a way of taking the things that happened on the outside and coming to understand that everything that happens on the outside is mirrored in what happens on the inside. And so each element of the sacrificial service, each element of the temple sanctuary represents also an internal state in us, and in that way continues on these thousands of years after the sanctuary is no longer. The altar is the heart of the Jew, and corresponding to the two altars of the sanctuary, the outer and the inner, are the outer and inner levels of the heart. So the ancient sanctuary was built as a set of concentric courtyards with, at its very, very heart, the Kodesh Kodeshim, the Holy of Holies, the space in which heaven and earth were said to touch. Outside of the Holy of Holies was an interior space only allowed to the priests and those who, as we read about in this week's Torah portion, descended from the original ordanees, the sons of Aaron. But then there was an outer courtyard accessible to all Jews. And that courtyard also had an altar, and we learned that the eternal flame was not on the altar that was closed off, that was only for the few, as Ruby said, but it was the altar for all. It was the flame that should be visible to the whole community. And this represents, says the Alter Rebbe, says Reb Shneur Zalman, this represents the inner and outer layers of the heart, the surface personality and the essential core. The altar on which the continuous fire was to be set was on the outer one. You might think that we're talking about an internal flame deep, deep down in the heart, that spark of holiness that lives in all of us. But instead, the Rebbe says, it's a flame which is meant to be visible. For the Jew, this means that the fire of their love of God must be outward, open, and revealed. It's not a private possession to be cherished subconsciously. It must show in the face that is set toward the world. Wow. Faith says this text, is not about having a deep down inside connection to God. Faith is about how we walk in the world. Connection to Torah is not about having a deep in the pit of your kishkas, in the pit of your guts, sense of connection to the Jewish people. It's about how you live and interact each and every day. My grandmother of blessed memory described herself as a cardiac Jew. What's a cardiac Jew? A cardiac Jew, aside from having high cholesterol, a cardiac Jew is a Jew who feels Jewish in their hearts, right? A Jew who feels a sense of connection to ancestry, but the only shul my grandmother ever walked into was a Unitarian church. She was not interested at all in rituals of Jewish life. The Alter Rebbe would have some words with my grandmother, and knowing my grandmother, she'd have some words back. But the text here is saying it's not enough to be cardiac Jews. It's not enough to just feel it. It has to be in how we walk, how we interact, how we are seen in the world. The values have to be put into practice. I often say at funerals, and I've been involved in far too many funerals lately, that when we say Zecher Livracha, that the memory of a person should be a blessing, that doesn't happen automatically. The only way that the memory of a person is a blessing is if you live their values out and make it a blessing. It's not about holding the memory inside. It's about walking in the light of the person whose light guided your life and who should continue to guide your life even if they're not physically at your side. And this brought to mind one of my favorite, and I think still little known, differences between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi and Mizrahi Passover Seder. The best known difference between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi and Mizrahi Passover Seder is whether you can eat rice on Passover. Everybody, right? What are you allowed to eat? How strict does your kashrut need to be? Are you allowed to have rice and beans at your table? That's not the distinction I'm interested in right now. The distinction I'm interested in is in the Haggadah's most important sentence. The most important sentence in the Passover Seder is B'kol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. In every generation, a person is obligated to see oneself as having come out of Egypt. That we are supposed to have an internal memory of being liberated from Egypt that we are supposed to connect with and identify with personally. This is the core mitzvah of Passover. It's not telling the story of somebody else. It's telling the story of us. It's telling the story of always. That's the Ashkenazi version. That's the version that most of us are familiar with. But the version of this line that's found in the Sephardic and Mizrahi, in the Haggadah that belongs to people of the Mediterranean, of North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula, there is one letter difference in the line that makes all the difference. In their Haggadah, following Maimonides, it says, B'kol dor v'dor chayav adam leharot et atzmo. There's an extra hey. It's not lirot et atzmo, to see oneself. Leharot et atzmo, which means to show oneself as one who left Egypt. In the Ashkenazi Seder that I know, we are obligated to see ourselves as one who came out of Egypt, to identify with that story on the inside. In the Sephardi and Mizrahi Haggadah, we are told explicitly, you're not just supposed to identify on the inside, you are supposed to show yourself as one who went out from Egypt. Somebody who sees you, who knows you, is supposed to be able to tell from the way that you walk in the world that you are a liberated slave. Somebody should be able to tell from the way that you walk in the world that you identify with those who are oppressed and downtrodden because you know what it is to be oppressed and downtrodden, and that you are animated by a fire in your belly that doesn't just live in your belly but actually comes out into your actions to be part of the liberation of the rest of the world. It's not enough to just feel, you have to show it. That's why my teacher, Rabbi Sharon Brous, calls us Exodus people. She says the Exodus tells the story of a descent, of redemption. It's a story in which, from the depths of darkness, we affirm the possibility of light. A story in which the people, for generations, squeezed in the narrowness of Mitzrayim, of Egypt, come to embody the expansiveness of human potential. A light unto the nations, a symbol for all time of the impossible made possible. Notice, what's the symbol? It's not the story, it's the people. We're supposed to symbolize for people that anything is possible because look at our story. Look what we overcame. We went from darkness to light. We went from degradation to dignity. And so it's possible for each and every person, but it's only possible if we walk the walk. If we actually put that goodness out into the world, if we struggle as sisters and brothers, as siblings, for the dignity of all. This week, as I said, was a week in which 1 million of our Israeli siblings took a stand for democracy, for their love of country, their deep and profound Zionism that they felt was at risk. That's a way of showing that we stand up to Pharaoh in every generation. This was a week that contained within it, just yesterday, the Trans and Non-Binary Day of Visibility, at a time in which state after state is passing laws specifically directed at vulnerable children with the highest rate of suicide of any group. State after state legislature is turning on those kids. This is a time to stand up and say we oppose pharaohs in every generation. We are on the side of liberation for all people. In a time in which challenge after challenge faces our world, we are not to be mired in cynicism. We are to lean into the optimism of the Passover story and to say that the world can get better. How do we know? Because it got better for us. And it got better for us, so it's our obligation to take everybody else along with us. It's not enough to have the fire burn inside. The fire has to be burning for everybody to see. That's our mission on Pesach. That's our mission as a people. That's what it is to leharot, to show that we came out of Egypt. Shabbat shalom.